in the interest of time, we will get going. Yeah, thank you very much everyone for joining. Good morning and welcome to this webinar where we will be exploring the insights and practical solutions to hopefully help you to navigate some of the complexities of renewable energy development and overcome kind of common obstacles that public bodies face in developing renewable energy projects. So just before we start, a little bit of housekeeping. So this webinar will be recorded and the recording will be able to be accessed on our website shortly after the webinar has ended and will also be shared via email. We will leave time for answering questions at the end of the presentation. So if you'd like to raise any questions during the presentation, please do feel free to submit these. There's a Q&A function within Zoom, which you should see at the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to respond to as many of the questions as we can in the session at the end. But if we aren't able to get through all the questions in the time provided, then do please feel free to reach out to us directly via email with any questions, and we will respond to you after the webinar. We'll provide contact details at the end of the presentation. Lastly, also just to warn you as well that you will receive a short survey following the webinar where we would welcome any of your feedback that you may have on the presentation. So this webinar is the fourth in a 6-part webinar series, which is exploring how to overcome common barriers to net zero in the public sector. So recordings for all of those webinars that have already taken place can be found on our website. And if you are interested, you're also invited to sign up to our final 2 webinars, which are coming up in the next couple of weeks on warm homes and place-based net zero. So here at the Carbon Trust, we are a mission-driven organisation, and we have the mission to accelerate the move to a decarbonised future. So we've been pioneers in this space for over 20 years, and we provide a wide range of services relating to climate change, where we work with businesses, governments, public bodies, and financial institutions across the UK and globally as well. Within the Cities and Regions team, we focus on actions that can be taken at the local level to tackle climate change. And when it comes to renewable energy, we have expertise in the likes of supporting policymakers and informing strategies, project identification, so the likes of sort of assessing land areas to find the most suitable areas for renewable energy project development and carrying out early feasibility work. We also support clients through all the project development stages of renewable energy development, and we support with project implementation, including procurement, construction, and operation. So we're one of the lead partners that deliver the Welsh Government Energy Service, and through this we've supported a large number of local authorities in Wales with renewable energy projects. We were also directly involved in setting up the Welsh Government-owned Renewable Energy Development Organisation, Trydan Gyrraedd Cymru. So to introduce myself, my name is Georgia Mostyn, and I'm manager in the Cities and Regions team. And today I'm joined by my colleagues Luke McLaughlin and Gemma Pring, both of whom are associates in the team, and all 3 of us are core members of the onshore renewables team. So now to head into the important stuff and the agenda for the webinar. I'll be providing a bit of context to project development and some of the most common barriers that we see public bodies face. And then the team are going to provide a high-level overview of further considerations and potential solutions, focusing on the areas of navigating grid connection barriers, internal organisational barriers, and financial barriers, before finishing off with hopefully around 10 minutes of Q&A. We would also love to get some of your inputs and thoughts from you on a few topics of conversation throughout the presentation. So we have a few interactive quiz questions, which should hopefully automatically pop up on your screens as and when we get to them. And we'd appreciate your input in there. So there are significant benefits to locally owned renewable energy, and public sector organisations play a crucial role in advancing this. So with rising energy costs and climate commitments and increasing public demand for sustainability, There really is a growing need for these public entities to lead by example and develop such projects. Some of these benefits to local energy include that locally owned renewable energy projects will form part of any locality's route to net zero. As well as this, using electricity that's generated close to the point of use increases efficiency in the energy system. Additionally, direct connection to local organizations can also benefit them to directly reduce carbon emissions, as well as energy bills, and reduce exposure to volatile energy prices. Local ownership of projects also offers more potential for other local benefits, such as job opportunities, environmental initiatives, community benefit funds, and ownership options. And importantly, publicly developed projects show public leadership and encourage broader community action against climate change. So last year, we delivered a webinar which covered the steps required to plan, develop, and implement and maintain a renewable energy project. If you'd like to revisit that webinar, it is still available on our website. So this presentation that we did highlighted the many elements to consider and the potential complexities of the development process. Developing renewable energy projects in the public sector in particular can be challenging due to a range of technical, financial, institutional, and political barriers. Over the coming slides, we will share possible ways in which some of the most common barriers can be navigated to lead to the successful development of your renewable energy projects. But before we do so, we would like to hear from you and your personal experience of which of the following you feel is the most predominant barrier to successful renewable energy project development. So these include grid connection barriers, so these things such as grid connection costs, timescales, export limitations, internal organizational barriers, so things like resource limitations and senior buy-in, and financial barriers, or finally, none of the above. So hopefully the quiz question will have popped up on your screen. If you'd like to submit your answers now, and I'll give everyone 30 seconds or so to do so. Brilliant, thank you everyone. So we're very aware that many organizations will be facing all of these types of barriers to differing extents, but we're just focusing on the top one in your experience. So yeah, really interesting to see there where the biggest challenges are being faced. As we say, there's kind of a range across all of those, and we'll be covering all of these topics over the coming slides. But to start with, I'll now hand over to Luke to present on barriers related to grid connection.
Thank you, Georgia. So yeah, I'm going to talk quickly about some grid connection barriers. A big challenge facing new renewable energy projects is obtaining timely and cost-effective grid connection offers from the network operators. This is location dependent, but new projects are often given connection dates well into the 2030s or offered grid connection offers where they may be unable to export electricity at certain times of generation. This is due to what we refer to as constraints on the electricity network. So the network infrastructure allows for a certain level of electricity to flow through its individual components. And where the amount of electricity that can flow between 2 points is close to its limit or even exceeds its limit, this is what we refer to as a constraint. The large increase in smaller energy generators over the last decade and aging electricity network infrastructure has led to more and more projects being subjected to long connection timescales and high connection costs as more network constraints are encountered. In addition to this, the legacy queue management process for grid connections has led to project connections being held up. Surprisingly, as of March 2025, the queue of projects looking to connect contained over double what is actually needed to meet 2050 targets. And the National Energy System Operator, or NESO, have acknowledged this challenge and are tackling it through an ongoing connections reform process. So how to identify grid connection barriers? Distributed network operators, known as DNOs, are the organizations that own and control the electricity distribution network, and they're responsible for connecting generators to suppliers and energy users and consumers. Engaging with your DNO is an essential aspect of identifying grid connection barriers, and each DNO has an extensive list of resources available that can help identify potential connection bottlenecks. One example of these resources are network capacity maps. At the bottom of this slide, you can see a snapshot of NGED's network capacity map, and it's a really useful tool that's available to the public, which provides information on the level of constraint at each substation across the network. So during the early stages of project development, maps like these can really provide valuable information about where connections may be more challenging. For projects that are slightly further along the development process, the DNOs can also provide additional information and guidance on more technical aspects of the proposed connection. Connection surgeries or budget estimates are free services that allow for a more detailed understanding of grid congestion in a local area. This is information that is provided directly by network engineers, and it can help identify key project blockers before submitting a formal grid application. So there are a few different ways that developers can tackle the challenge of high grid connection costs or long connection times. But the best approach will really depend on three main factors. The first is the type of technology being used. The second is the size of the project. And the third is where the project is located. One option is to look at alternative connection points on the grid. So while this might increase capital costs, mainly due to the need for longer cabling, it could still lead to an overall financial or timeline benefit, especially if it helps avoid costly grid reinforcement works. Network constraints maps, like the one I showed on the previous slide, can be a valuable tool here, helping identify areas with better import or export capacity. This strategy tends to work best for larger scale projects where additional cabling costs are relatively small compared to the overall capital investment. For smaller projects like rooftop solar or small hydro schemes, even a short extension cabling distance can actually make the whole project financially unviable. Another fairly simple approach is actually to scale down the overall generation capacity. So in many cases, grid reinforcements are only triggered when a project exceeds a certain capacity threshold. So by slightly reducing the project size, you might actually avoid delays and additional costs altogether. And in some cases, if reinforcement works are already in progress, this size reduction might only need to be temporary, which would allow you to actually phase a project over time. So naturally, this approach is especially well suited to solar PV, which can be built out in modular segments. A third option is to accept an alternative connection offer with what's called non-firm network access. So what exactly does this mean? Normally, a standard grid connection gives you firm access, meaning your project can export at full capacity at all times, with the exception of during outages. But in areas where the grid is already heavily constrained, network operators may offer a non-firm connection. So these actually allow you to connect sooner, but with a trade-off. During certain periods of high network usage, your export capacity may be curtailed or even shut off entirely. This kind of arrangement is being increasingly used by DNOs as a way to keep projects moving without waiting for long reinforcement works to be completed. But it's really important to understand that curtailment affects your generation consistency and ultimately your revenue. To help developers assess the impact of this risk, DNOs often provide curtailment assessments, either with the connection offer or on request. And these reports are usually based on historical data and seasonal trends. So they're really useful to give you an estimate of how often and for how long curtailment might occur. Another option worth considering is setting up a private wire arrangement. So this can be a really smart way to get around some of the typical grid connection challenges. In simple terms, a private wire setup allows the electricity you generate to be used directly, either by your own organization or by a third party that's physically connected to your site through a dedicated private cable. By consuming the power on site or nearby, you can significantly reduce the amount you need to export to the grid without actually having to scale back the generation capacity of your project. In many cases, this kind of arrangement requires an export limitation scheme. So these schemes are designed to ensure that exports to the grid don't exceed a pre-agreed limit, sometimes even reducing the export to zero. They use real-time monitoring at the grid connection point to measure how much power is flowing out and then automatically scale back generation if needed to avoid overloading the local network. And what's good about this is that this can open up connection opportunities in area where the grid is already constrained, allowing projects to move forward without necessarily having to wait for the full reinforcement works. Now, in addition to enabling faster and lower cost grid connections, there are two other key benefits arising from the direct consumption of the generated electricity. The first advantage is that private wires can support organizational net zero targets and scope 2 emissions reduction through direct consumption of renewable electricity. Secondly, there can be financial benefits of self-consumption or sale to a third party by offsetting higher cost electricity imported from the grid or achieving a more favorable private wire tariff. If you're selling electricity to a nearby third party, which is known as an off-taker, you'll need to set up a power purchase agreement, or PPA. This is the legal contract that outlines the terms of the electricity sale. A common example of an off-taker might be a local business with high energy demand. So think of a factory or a data center or even a large retail unit. And these private wire PPA arrangements can be a win-win for both sides. So as the generator, you can often secure a price better than you'd get by exporting to the grid. And at the same time, the consumer benefits by paying less than they would through their normal electricity supplier. And they can also lock in those prices to protect against future energy cost increases. It's really important to get legal advice when pursuing a PPA, both to make sure that the contract terms are fair, but also to understand how supply license exemptions will apply. Installing a private wire connection to the off-taker does come with costs, especially if the cable has to cover a long distance. If the generation site is right next to the consumer or even on the same premises in some instances, then the economics usually work out well. But the further apart the sites are, the more expensive the installation becomes. There are a number of other things that need to be considered when planning the cabling route. So the first consideration are ground conditions. Typically, it's cheaper to dig through farmland or open green space than it is to build through built-up areas and roads. Obstacles need to also be considered. So any major infrastructure, think railway lines or rivers and bridges, all of those can add significant cost and complexity to the private wire. And lastly, it's important not to understate the importance of considering land ownership. So if your private wire crosses someone else's land, you'll need to negotiate way leaves or easements, and that can really introduce a lot of legal delays and extra costs. So while a private wire PPA can be a very effective way to make your project more financially viable, it's essential to do a thorough technical and financial assessment early on before any major investment is made. When you're considering supplying electricity directly to a local consumer, one of the most important things to look at is how well your generation profile matches the consumer's demand profile. And this basically means when you're generating power, how much of it are they actually using? So to figure this out, you can analyze half-hourly electricity consumption data from the consumer and compare it with simulated generation data from your proposed system, whether that's a solar project, wind, or another technology. And this comparison helps you determine whether the project makes sense technically and financially, and also what the most appropriate scheme size would be. Generally, the better the match between supply and demand, the more likely the project is to be financially viable. The type of technology that you choose will play a big part in this. For example, solar PV is great for off-takers that use most of their energy during daylight hours, like an office or a manufacturing facility that runs from 9 to 5. But it's less suitable for businesses with 24/7 operations because obviously solar doesn't generate at night. Wind, on the other hand, has a more variable output and can produce energy throughout the day and night, which might make it a better fit for continuous demand profiles. So the graph at the bottom of the slide represents an example of what a demand and generation profile can look like. You can see the solar farm's output significantly exceeds the off-taker's demand during the daytime periods, particularly in summer. But the fairly consistent demand of the off-taker means that only a fifth of the generation is actually being consumed, with the remainder being exported to the grid. It's also really important to think ahead. Demand can grow over time, for example, through the electrification of heating or transport, or if new buildings are added to a site. And on the flip side, you also need to be confident in the long-term stability of the off-taker. If they scale down operations, if they relocate, if they shut down, and you're relying on them as your main consumer, that could leave you in a really difficult spot, especially in instances where exporting to the grid isn't a viable fallback option. There is also the option to supply multiple off-takers through what we call a microgrid, and this could improve your generation to demand matching and reduce financial risk, but it does bring added technical and legal complexity, along with higher costs typically. So definitely something to weigh up carefully during early stage feasibility work. So it is important to identify and address grid connection barriers early on in the development process, as they are one of the major hindrances of renewable energy development. By identifying issues early on, you can prioritize projects accordingly and also design projects to account for the constraints so that they can still progress in a timely and also in a viable manner. An understanding of the grid status can also improve the accuracy of your financial modeling and business case preparation by including additional contingency costs. Early discussions with the distribution network operators and a proactive approach are the keys to success. To minimize the risks of projects falling through, regular engagement with the DNOs and their tools is essential. Identifying potential off-takers early on is also encouraged, not only as an alternative solution to grid connection barriers, but also because it can improve the financial viability of schemes. The UK government, NESO, and the DNOs are all aware of the importance of feasible and timely grid connections in order to reach our net zero targets, and they are actively working to optimize the queue management process. NESO have implemented connection reform measures covering the network in Great Britain to try and address this, moving from a first come, first served to a first ready and needed, first connected system. And what this will do is it will reorder the existing queue based on strict readiness criteria and by which projects are most needed on a regional basis according to NESO's modeling. This will only apply to new projects above a certain megawatt threshold, and therefore we advise regularly reviewing NESO's online web pages and their public-facing reports to ensure that you have the most recent information of the eligibility criteria. Now, before I hand over to my colleague Gemma, we've got another poll which should hopefully flash up on your screen momentarily. And we're curious to know whether or not you've ever engaged with your local DNO regarding any projects that you are developing. So yeah, I'm gonna let this sit for 30 seconds or so, give you a chance to answer. Hopefully it's popping up on your screen now. There we go. I think that's coming through now. Great, so hopefully you've all had a chance to answer the question. Great, and on that note, I will then hand over to my, there we go. I've just seen some answers come up. Really interesting to hear. So a lot of you have already engaged with the local DNO. Some are still waiting to do so. Great, thank you all for answering that poll. And yeah, I will now hand over to my colleague Gemma, who will take us on with internal organizational barriers.
Great, thanks, Luke. So in this section, I'd firstly
like to look at the possible barriers that can prevent a project progressing, followed by looking at the potential solutions to overcoming these barriers prior to moving on to the wider benefits that can arise from projects. So starting with the internal organisational barriers, any renewable energy or energy efficiency project can face barriers throughout any stage of works. Ensuring the internal organisational barriers are recognised can help a project move smoothly. So some of the most common barriers in this area include recognising a project requires sufficient internal resource to deliver the scheme. So it's always a good idea to have project knowledge resilience within any team to ensure the project can cope with any change in staffing members and or staffing absence. So any scheme will likely have lengthy development timelines with costly surveys, which without presenting a strong outline business case, it could be difficult to secure senior team buy-in and funding, which on occasion can cause projects to lose momentum and fall off the priority list for the public body as the cost rises and time lapses, with focus unfortunately moving to other projects. So to help overcome and navigate the barriers, it is important to establish a clear focus on any project from the outset, setting an achievable and realistic timeline and ensuring access to funding is available to support the development. With many different aspects required to allow a project to commence, it's especially important to set and celebrate those mini milestones whilst keeping in mind the wider benefits associated with the scheme development. So there are different delivery models which may help to overcome some of the potential barriers. So I'll discuss two potential options shortly. We've got a community-led and also a joint venture ones that we'll be looking into. So prior to digging into these, we invite you to answer then another, our next poll question. So, and that is, has your organisation ever delivered or considered delivering a project via a community ownership or a joint venture delivery model? So we'll just, the question will be popping up now. So I'll just leave that open for 30 seconds or so. And it'd be great if you can participate in that one. Okay, great, thanks. We'll just let that sit for another couple of seconds. See if any answers coming through. Okay, great. So that's really interested in the answers there. So hopefully the next section then will encourage those who have considered to use the models but never actually deliver through the project or never considered the models to start considering these models then for future project delivery methods. So moving on to the first delivery model, community-led development could help a project to be resourced. So if the public body, for whatever reason, does not wish to develop a project themselves, they could look at allowing the scheme to be developed through a community-led model. So to get the ball rolling on this, the public body appoints a community group to deliver the project, with the contractual arrangement setting out the public body's expectations for during the development, delivery, and decommissioning stages of project works. So the benefits of this model is that this option requires minimal intervention from the public body following the appointment of the community group. So the public body could still look to invest in the scheme through a community share offer, for example. But as I mentioned, the contractual arrangement will set out the public body's expectations for the scheme with a procurement documentation setting out any community benefits expected. For example, the educational opportunities. And lastly, the public body would enter into a power purchase agreement with the community group and potentially lease agreement, which would provide a savings compared to grid electricity and allow for the public body to decarbonise their electricity supply at site. So any risks with either of the generation or supply would have generally been dealt with by the contracting arrangement, and as such, the public body would retain less control of the overall project,
and this aspect is normally viewed as the biggest risk for this delivery model. So then continuing with our second resourcing option for development, we'll now look at the joint venture model. So this is a collaboration where the public sector body could partner with a separate organisation, which could be either public, private or community entity, to deliver the project, allowing for shared risks, rewards and control. So this model would typically require a new company with representation from both organisations, or it could be purely a contractual partnership. So a project such as this would be delivered through a special purpose vehicle, an SPV, which would be part owned by a separately appointed organisation and part owned by the public sector body. So the SPV agreement would govern both the distribution of any profits, control, and risk between the delivery partners. So any joint venture, as with any project, comes with both its benefits and its risks. So look at the benefits. First, this option allows the public body to exercise more control through the project delivery. So if partnering with a community group, the project would benefit from any funding solely available to community groups. Also, experienced community groups could bring required expertise directly into the project delivery, such as project management, expertise in the planning process, or operation and maintenance of the scheme, therefore reducing the resource and expertise needed to be provided by the public body. Moving on to the risks. This model is very complex and costly to agree and set up. However, this arrangement does allow the public body's exposure to development risk to be reduced in comparison to a solely public body owned option. It's important to remember that for certain directors in the public sector, investment in such a scheme would need to adhere to the subsidy control rules, which could reduce the benefit of the project. So legal advice would be required to support this, which could be an added cost to this delivery model. So to help support any business case and to engage and secure senior team buy-in, the wider benefits of public sector scheme development should be highlighted and held at the forefront of any scheme development plan. It's important to consider all the outcomes which you wish to achieve from a project early on in its development to ensure that these can be retained and realised. So let's consider the wider benefits of the project now. So reducing carbon footprint shows leadership. So climate change requires action at all levels, and local community project engagement can raise awareness of climate change issues and options to address these, as well as demonstrating to the local community that the council are taking action and showing leadership within this area. Many public sector bodies have set ambitious targets to become net zero. Achieving these targets requires a combination of energy efficiency measures and renewable energy generation, and connecting to a larger asset can obviously have a much greater impact. But wider than just considering organisational net zero targets, public sector bodies can show real leadership in supporting area-wide net zero ambitions by developing grid export renewable energy development projects, or indeed those selling electricity to nearby organisations. Moving on then to the second group of benefits, generating revenue and reducing energy costs. So in this one, the public sector organisations developing the renewable energy projects can generate revenue from electricity sales and reduce their own energy costs via direct use of the electricity generated. So even where the electricity is not directly consumed by the owning organisation, by participating directly in the energy market, this can help reduce the exposure to energy price volatility. Our next point then is sleeving arrangements, which can be used to link electricity generation with consumption. Even where this mechanism is used by directly selling electricity into the energy market whilst buying electricity from it, organisations can reduce the impact of electricity price increases, as whilst the increases may be felt on the side of the organisation consuming the electricity, it can be partially offset by the benefits to the side of the organisation that is selling the electricity generated. And finally, savings made from the project then can be ring-fenced and help to support the future decarbonisation and environmental projects of the public body. and they will significantly contribute to supporting the wider public sector objectives, which we'll now move on to explore. So certainly beyond the direct financial and carbon benefits that arise from any renewable energy development, public sector bodies across the UK have legal obligations regarding protecting and enhancing biodiversity. So biodiversity improvements are an integral element of renewable energy development, with improvements including planting schemes and habitat improvements, for example. Public sector bodies can also use the development, construction and operation of the renewable energy assets to help support wider public body economic objectives relating to stimulating the local economy and job creation. It's important that any generating asset should be celebrated by the public body, and if in a public viewing space, integrating educational elements of the scheme in the form of information boards and viewing panels helps to connect the scheme to the wider public, and it's hopefully favourably received, which will help the public body moving forward with the future projects. Another benefit then is that any project can be designed to support the leisure benefits. So for example, including integrating new public rights of way within development can help enhance accessibility and promote physical activity. And moving on to the final point in this section, the decarbonisation activities such as heat electrification and EV charging could be integrated into a project, potentially improving the business case and enabling the development of a larger asset. But I've outlined a number of ways in which renewable energy development can be used to help complement other strategies and duties that public sector bodies are looking to fulfil through direct delivery of renewable energy schemes, and to help secure the senior buy-in team and to remove any internal organisational barriers. I will now move over to Georgia, who will take us through the financial barriers.
Thanks, Gemma. Brilliant. So in terms of financial barriers, obviously renewable energy projects often require significant initial investment. So identifying and securing suitable sources of funding is a common hurdle. Such projects kind of require input from a number of different external specialists, and construction costs themselves can be high, especially if faced with high grid connection costs, which Luke covered earlier. Not only this, but right from initial concept stage, investment in these projects is high risk, and risk only reduces with increased investment through the development stages. So sort of justifying the funding to even just scope out a potential opportunity can be difficult. These are particular concerns for public bodies who have kind of limited budgets and competing investment priorities. The length of payback periods for such projects can also be a deterrent for some organisations, given budget cycles and short-term priorities. In addition to this, public bodies may also face additional restrictions on borrowing or have low credit ratings, making it more difficult to secure loans. So, as mentioned, organisational reserves are often not available to finance the capital investment requirements of a renewable energy project. So public bodies must look externally for funding sometimes. A snapshot of potential funding sources available to public bodies is shown here, but this list is by no means exhaustive, and the funding landscape is constantly changing. The optimal funding source will also be project-specific and organisation-specific. But when you do have a project that requires funding, it is worth ensuring that you have explored as many available options as possible. The project does not need to be funded from one single source, but could be funded through a combination of sources. The funding sources available to the project will partly depend on the ownership structure, so that's worth considering. So it's worth noting that other funding sources that are available to community groups. So as well as adding local benefits, as Gemma mentioned earlier, having a community group involved in delivering or owning a project has the potential to also unlock additional funding streams. When reviewing different sources of funding, there's a few things that are worth considering. So, for example, the cost of the finance. The cost of borrowing is currently relatively high for public bodies, and so securing loans with low interest rates can make or break a project. The flexibility in the repayment profile is another consideration. So some funding sources, for example, community shares, allow flexibility in their repayments to investors, which supports a healthy cash flow and can improve the project viability. The time to raise the capital. So some funds require identifying and securing multiple investors, which can take time and mean the project requires a loan to bridge the gap. Some funding sources can also have added complexity through initial due diligence, ongoing management, and admin requirements, and therefore can also come with additional operational costs which need to be considered. The repayment period is also worth noting, so understanding if this extends to or beyond the life of the asset itself. And finally, the minimum scale funding. So if you're funding a portfolio of projects to meet the minimum funding requirements of a funding source, there will need to be a kind of high level of assurance that all of those projects will progress to installation at the same time. So where appropriate, external finance can't be easily accessed and internal capital is not available to a project, there is a significant opportunity in most organisations for raising additional funds internally that more often than not goes unrecognised. So the majority of public bodies in the UK will have already made significant investment to date in small-scale renewable energy projects, including the likes of rooftop solar. The crucial relationship between operational management of renewable assets and the energy generated is really well known by the owners of large-scale renewable generation. However, operational management of the small or micro generation has generally and wrongly been assumed to be unnecessary or not cost-effective. So this attitude has left a legacy of undermanaged, what we call fit and forget rooftop solar installations. Based on our research and experience, it's common to find unmonitored arrays that are often not generating, or they're partially working, or in some cases have never even been switched on. So it's been proven that a small amount of time and resource investment in monitoring and managing the performance of all your existing assets has a significant impact on maximizing their availability to generate and provides the opportunity to easily avoid carbon emissions and financial expenditure that could be being used for funding new renewable energy projects. In addition to this, some organisations are also missing the opportunity to receive revenue where they export surplus electricity to the grid. Underperforming solar PV in the UK is often caused by shading, things like dirt and debris, faulty components, and issues with the initial installation quality. But we've also experienced that it could be more simply caused by things like a lack of an awareness of even the existence or location of assets, or the accountability for managing generation performance. In addition, inadequate metering, controls, and communication infrastructure is often something that we see. And inadequate handover after installation and upskilling of personnel within the team. The active solar management can be outsourced to a third-party expert, so a sort of solar asset manager, or with the appropriate guidance and resource, it can be conducted in-house. But essentially, it's really worthwhile sort of pausing to take stock of your existing assets, assessing their performance, and quantifying the potential scale of annual costs and carbon benefits that could be being needlessly thrown away. So there is potential as well for the financial viability of a renewable energy project to be supported through additional revenue from the asset partaking in grid flexibility services. So this potential is very project specific and requires detailed design and financial modelling, but could be worth exploring for one of your projects. Grid flexibility is the electricity grid's ability to rapidly adjust power generation and consumption to maintain a stable balance between supply and demand. NESO and the DNOs provide mechanisms through which generators and storage facilities can receive payments for providing flexibility services. So due to the less predictable nature of renewable generation assets, generally battery storage will typically need to be integrated into the system to provide those flexibility services. So these services allow the renewable generator to earn revenue by adjusting its output or managing its storage capacity to support grid stability, balance supply and demand, and earn payments for availability during stress events. It should be noted that certain revenue streams require 24/7 manned operation, the cost of which will need to be accounted for in the business case. Wholesale electricity arbitrage is another way in which a battery can support increased revenue. So arbitrage takes advantage of sort of price fluctuations in the wholesale electricity market and involves buying electricity when prices are low, storing it, and selling it when prices are high. Co-locating the batteries with a solar farm can increase the revenue further, as it allows the battery to be charged using the electricity generated by your renewable asset, rather than purchasing it from the grid at a low price. As well as improving the business model of a new project, it should also be considered that the battery integration is also a potential avenue to increase revenue for existing assets as well. So, as Luke explained earlier, private wire arrangements to self-supply or directly supply a third-party off-taker not only can help avoid grid connection constraints and associated costs, but these arrangements also provide the most revenue to a project due to the relatively high price that could be agreed in a private off-taker power purchase arrangement, or the even higher price that can be offset through self-consumption of that generated electricity. If an asset does not have private wire options, however, and must export some or all of its electricity to the grid, the amount of revenue from the power purchase agreement with an energy supplier is limited by the price agreed with the supplier, which is typically lower than the wholesale baseload market price at the time of the agreement, which is currently around 6 pence per kilowatt hour. There is potential to secure a higher price than the wholesale market via a government initiative called Smart Export Guarantee, which essentially mandates certain electricity suppliers to pay renewable generators of up to 5 megawatts for electricity that they export to the grid. Some suppliers offer very favourable tariffs, so at present some are even offering up to 40 pence per kilowatt hour. However, these high prices usually come as an incentive, so require the generator to be on the supplier's import tariff, or in some cases for the asset to have been installed by the supplier themselves. It should also be noted that the Smart Export Guarantee prices are also not guaranteed for the life of the project. So at the moment, 24 months is the longest term period known to be currently offered. So after this, the supplier could choose to offer a lower price, so there is less certainty in these revenues. So if you have an eligible existing or new asset, it really is worth exploring what your supplier or other suppliers are offering through the Smart Export Guarantee and how this could be supporting your project business case if you're not already receiving payments for your export to grid. So while we're exploring possible solutions to funding barriers and project viability, we would just like to pause now to ask one final question to you. Are you aware of what a local energy scheme is? So your possible answers here are yes, I'm actively engaged in a scheme. Yes, I've heard of local energy schemes, but I'm not engaged in one. Or no, I'm not familiar with local energy schemes. So hopefully that's popped up on your screens now. So your answer here could be referring to you personally or maybe reflective of your organization's experience. I'll just give 30 seconds or so just to allow everyone some time to answer that. Okay, let's see if we get some answers popping up on the screen. There we go, brilliant. Excellent. Yeah, really interesting to see. So yeah, lots of you not familiar with local energy schemes, but equally, yeah, great to see that some of you have heard of them, and some great, even better to see that some of you are engaged in them. So I'm not surprised to see some of you are aware of and engaged with local energy schemes. We are seeing a growing interest in these as a result of proposed regulatory changes, which, if approved, may provide additional value to locally supplied electricity. And therefore sort of significantly strengthen the viability of local energy schemes. So for those who aren't aware, let me explain local energy schemes, firstly in the context of sleeved PPAs and how these alternative power purchase agreements have the potential to improve the financial viability of a renewable energy development. So sleeving allows a large consumer to buy solar power directly from the generator without a private wire arrangement. The supplier enters into a back-to-back contract with both the generator and the consumer, as shown in this diagram, and the consumer agrees to buy the electricity at a set unit price. The generator receives this price minus any kind of admin fees and all the supplier's profit margin, for that generation, and then the consumer receives an equivalent amount of energy from the supplier at the agreed set price. So the generator is able to receive a greater price for the electricity in a sleeved arrangement compared to a standard PPA because of the time-matched generation and demand, which is more valuable to both the supplier and the third-party off-taker. The duration of the sleeved PPA contract is agreed between the generator, the consumer, and the supplier, with contracts generally being longer-term contracts up to the lifetime of the project. So a local energy scheme operates in a very similar way to sleeving, except the consumer of the electricity is not one single off-taker, but instead a pool of multiple local energy users. So a typical arrangement for local energy schemes currently operating is for a group of consumers local to each other to form a cooperative and pool their demand together. They all need to be supplied by the same primary substation, connected at the same voltage, and have smart meters installed. This limits the amount of demand that can be pulled together to match the generation, and therefore limits the size of the generator that could enter into a scheme. The scheme participants pay an agreed rate to the scheme supplier when they match their electricity consumption to the local generation, and this is passed through to the generator. If a generator that is selling electricity via sleeving arrangement or local energy scheme is eligible for a supply license exemption, there is potential for additional financial benefits to be achieved through the direct electricity sales. However, this would require legal advice and an exempt supply notification agent to be involved to enable this. The local energy schemes have the potential to provide economic benefits to members of the local community through reduced energy costs and can empower the local community to take control of their electricity supply. Proposed changes to the electricity market code that I mentioned earlier may lead to local energy schemes having that greater flexibility in the future and greater potential to realize value. So it's important to be aware of these and to keep abreast of the proposed changes in the market. So this brings us to the end of our presentation, which I'm sure has sparked some questions. So please feel free to submit any of these via the Q&A function. I can see that some have already come through. So thank you to those who've already submitted those questions. Luke, I believe you've been monitoring the chat. So would you like to share any questions that have come through?
Yes, thank you, Georgia. And yeah, thanks to everyone who's already put a question in the Q&A. Some really interesting things here. And yeah, I think anything that we don't get through in the next 7 minutes, we can follow up offline. So one of the first questions, which I can answer quickly, is a private wire the same thing as going to an independent DNO? No. An independent DNO owns and maintains electricity across a specific area, so they have to abide by similar regulations as traditional DNOs. A private wire should really be thought of as a direct connection between the generating asset and the off-taker, which will be a business, a college, a hospital. So in essence, it's an additional connection which you'll need. You'll have your grid connection, and then you'll also have a private wire connection to the off-taker that's using the electricity directly. Another question is, do generation systems connected through private wire still need to be connected to the grid, or can energy storage options be built into the business case to deal with any excess produced, and what are the disadvantages in doing so? So to answer that question, no, a grid connection is not needed, but this would be considered an off-grid system, and energy storage systems would almost certainly be a crucial component to this. A grid connection is desirable because of its reliability and its potential to manage the export of excess generation or provide energy during times when there's not enough generation. Which means that if you don't have a grid connection, you really have to make some careful calculations of capacity to ensure consistency in your power supply. So yeah, I would say the main disadvantages, or rather the main risks, are high costs of energy storage system, but also the potential for over and under generation, which can either lead to shortages in electricity or the potential loss of revenue opportunities from selling to the grid. We've got another question on the theme of storage. Could a storage option help to enable flexibility where grid connections are constrained? And if that's all right with you, Georgia, I'll hand that question over to you to answer.
Yes. Yeah, I think that question came in earlier in the presentation, so hopefully the slides I presented on the flexibility there helps answer those. But yes, effectively with a private wire arrangement, if you're connected behind the meter, then that can help with reducing the amount of electricity. A battery could help to reduce the amount of electricity that's needing to be exported to grid, where you're kind of charging the battery at times of low demand from the private off-taker. So that helps with load balancing, but yeah, equally with the flexibility options that I mentioned, if you're connected in front of the meter, then that can help with generating revenue for the project as well. It will dependent. You will also need, whenever you've got a battery connected, you'll also need to include that within your grid connection agreement. So the ability to connect at that certain point that you're looking to in the network, and to connect batteries as well as your renewable generation asset, that will depend on conversations that you have with the DNO and the specific kind of fault levels or other electricity grid requirements in the area. So it will be project dependent as to whether the batteries can help with the grid connection. But that's just something that you can engage with your DNO in the ways that Luke presented at the beginning.
Great, thank you, Georgia. I think we've got enough time for one more question, and I think Gemma is best suited to answer this. So the question reads: how would we go about identifying and engaging with a community group who may be interested in developing on our land and supplying us with electricity?
Thanks, Luke. I think some we'd suggest reaching out to community trade bodies such as sort of Community Energy England, and also government support schemes such as Wedgies and CARES, and looking at the net zero hubs.
Great, thank you, Gemma. I think we're just about out of time. Georgia, I'll hand over back to you to close out the webinar.
We've had lots of questions come through there, so we will pick up. We can pick up offline and answer in the email that goes around to everyone afterwards. We can answer any questions. Equally, I will just click onto the next slide, which shows how you can get in touch with us. So please feel free to reach out to us directly via any of these means with any further questions about the presentation, or if you would like to understand further how we can help you with your renewable energy project development. And also just to flag that through our involvement with Innovate UK's Net Zero Living programme, we will soon be publishing a series of insights documents which go into some of these topics that we've covered in the webinar in more detail. So please do follow us and keep an eye out for those as and when they are published. But brilliant. Thank you very much, everyone, for your time, and have a good rest of your day.